it's all taken over by Dr. Wani once I introduce and give it to Wani. You, Dr. Sunil, Dr. Geeta, and Dr.
Yeah.
Wani. Here.
Can they find some more sources where they can cut back on expenditure and do such expenditure switching? So that
We are on air.
You're on air.
Yeah.
providing definitely we need to ensure that there will be different kinds of process water. So that we will come towards the starting of the session.
A very warm welcome to all attendees on to this webinar on the very important topic of end of life care in COVID-19. So without much further ado, I will invite our first speaker, Dr. Sunil Dhiliwal, who is a consultant in pain and palliative medicine, to start with his presentation. Dr. Sunil, welcome.
Yeah.
Dr.
Thank
Sunil
you. Thank
and
you for the,
Dr. Wani, just a minute, Dr. Sunil. You just given 1 minute for them to join in. It's good if you can give them 2 more minutes and then you can start. Dr.
Yeah.
Sunil.
Sure.
And in the meantime, I'll just ask the kind attendees or the participants. There is a button to press, and you can post your questions in the Q&A section where you can post your questions basically. And there's another thing called as chat box where you're able to comment, and you can send your any messages to anyone privately also, and to all of the panelists. So please use the Q&A section for asking questions. And today's moderator is Dr. Wani. Dr. Wani is a consultant psychiatrist in Mumbai. She has done her MD from Nimans, and she has been a private practitioner in Mumbai. Okay, so I think yeah, it's still going on, so we can still wait for 2 more minutes. So 18:35, 2 more
Yeah,
minutes.
the
2 more
quorum of
minutes.
25 should be good.
Yeah, question and answer. Questions in Q&A section, please.
Yeah, so see, like it was a very long game.
And unfortunately, this type of webinar doesn't allow the participants to actually speak and come on video. But nevertheless, Dr. Wani will try and make it more interactive at the end. Okay. Now, without much, without wasting much time, I'll hand it over to Wani. Wani, 1 more minute and you can start.
Yeah.
So
So I've to the latecomers or to the recently joined people, again I extend my warm welcome. In the current pandemic situation, I think psychiatrists have a role to play in terms of some of the patients who require end of life care, and we thought this was a very important topic where psychiatrists contribution is useful. So we have with us an expert here, Dr. Sunil Dhiliwal. He's from Mumbai, and he's a consultant in pain and palliative care medicine, and he will educate us about the various definitions, various contexts of end of life care with respect to the COVID pandemic. Welcome, Dr. Sunil.
Thank you, Dr. Wani, and all the people who are listening to me. It's a very glad to hear me, but it's very important topic for almost all the healthcare workers, not only psychiatrists, and for any person who are actually dealing with life-limiting illness patient or any geriatric care population. So it's not only for medical healthcare practitioners like doctors and nurses or psychiatrists and counselors. It's for those caregivers also who are actually taking care of the patients. So I'll be talking mainly. It is very difficult to talk about this topic in 20 minutes, but I'll try to bring up some important points which are essential to be known at least by healthcare workers. So it is very easy to say ki end of life care. It's not end of life care. It's actually planning whole of life. So we all want to live nicely. And that's the culture which we have brought in up. So हम मरने की बात नहीं करते हैं, हम जीने की बात करते हैं. But it's almost the same. It's like we are living every day. From another aspect, you can tell that we are dying every day because हर दिन हमारा एक कम हो रहा है. So we are -1 every day when we go ahead. So planning is essential, at least for those people who are actively diagnosed with life-limiting illness. And it is not only for those people, it is for all of us. If we do not come forward and talk about death, then it is very difficult to provide quality of life. So I'll not take much time on explaining the need. The need is much in the society, but let's start up what we are here for today. So my slides will be in two parts. First, I'll be talking about death and the legalities involved in death, dying process, and end of life care management. And second is the current pandemic situation, wherein I have taken 4 most important symptoms and their management. I'll try to cover in 20-25 minutes slot. Let's begin. So comes up with the slide 1, if someone can change. Slide 1. Indians die badly. Now, this was brought home by the quality of death report. If you can quickly change the slide 2. So here we see the study was done by the Economic Intelligence Unit, LIN, and this study was done twice. One was in 2010 and other was in 2015. So in 2010, they studied quality of death for 40 countries, 40. And very unfortunate and very sad to say that India's rank was 40th. I mean, in those 40 countries, the quality of death was much on a lower side in India. And when we, next slide please, when we did this study in 2015, the rank was still more worsened, and from 40th rank, we went to 67th rank. Now, this does not seem to depend on money alone, as can be attested by many of us who have had an elderly relative pass away in a hospital ICU. Healthcare in India has improved with the best technology being available at Indian hospitals at lower cost from developed countries. But the revolution in end-of-life care has passed us by. So low public health spending on primary care and the lack of insurance cover have seen the cost of dying rise significantly in the past 2 decades. But the unknown or known or bigger missing element is the lack of capacity in our system for providing palliative and compassionate end-of-life care. It is also because as a society, we have not addressed adequately the complex issue of when to let go when the time comes, avoiding burdensome non-beneficial treatments. So put together, this leads to catastrophic health expenses. Now, healthcare providers are often blamed correctly or incorrectly, but when medical futility results in death and deaths, this further feeds into the wider narrative and public anger about the inequities in our healthcare system. So, reading about death and providing proper end-of-life care is actually essential. Next slide, please. So, when we are talking about death, we should know what is death. According to the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, the simple definition of death is defined as the simultaneous and irreversible onset of apnea and unconsciousness in the absence of the circulation. Next slide. So before we go ahead with our discussion, we should understand certain few technical terms. If we understand this, the whole concept will be much clearer. So when we are talking about end of life, you should know what is end of life care. It's an approach to a terminally ill patient that shifts the focus of care to the symptom control, comfort, dignity, quality of life, and quality of dying, rather than treatment aimed at cure or prolongation of life. And when you term a terminal illness, that means the one from which recovery cannot be expected with the available treatment. And yes, that is considered to be an unavoidable, unforeseeable future. Euthanasia is a very debative topic. Now, euthanasia is the intentional act of killing a dying patient with terminal illness by the direct intervention of a doctor for the purpose of good of the patient. Here, the most important thing you have to remember that allowing natural death, withholding and withdrawing of life-sustaining treatment to limit harm and suffering in a dying patient should not be construed as euthanasia. Next slide. Surrogate. Now, surrogate is a person or persons other than healthcare providers. This has to be remembered by all the healthcare workers, because we tend to sign so many consent forms for every small procedure to everything. You should understand this point very precisely. So, surrogate is a person or persons other than the healthcare providers who are accepted as the representatives of the patient's best interest, who will make decisions on behalf of patient when the patient loses his or her capacity to make the healthcare decisions. So it has to be nominated or designated primarily by patient who may or may not be the family member. And in absence of such designation or nomination, the next of the kin of the patient will be considered as surrogates. Now, so when we go home today, at least we healthcare practitioners should appoint one person and tell that person what we want, how the treatment should be if we are diagnosed with any life limiting illness, or in this pandemic if we are contracted with coronavirus situation, then what and what not to be done from my side. If we do that, then only we can preach. So practice and preach. Next slide. Next slide. So advance directive. Now, this is one of the important terminology to be known by every healthcare worker. Again, it's a statement made by a person with the decision-making capacity stating his or her wishes regarding how to be treated or not to be treated at a stage when he or she loses such capacity. Advance directives includes living wills or healthcare proxies and become operational only after the person loses the capacity. Once we understand this, we can go to the next slide about how to prepare dying. Next slide, please. So now, one cut short to the process, how to prepare dying. Now, this according to the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. So, advanced care planning is making decisions about the care of the patient. Making decision about the care the patients would like to receive if they become unable to speak for themselves. So these are the decisions the patient should make regardless of what they choose for their future care, and the decisions that are based on patients' personal values or preferences and the discussions with their loved ones. So now advanced care planning includes 4 important points, which is there on the screen. Number 1, getting information on the types of life-sustaining treatment that are available. Number 2, deciding what types of treatment patient would or would not should they be diagnosed with a life-limiting illness. 3, sharing their personal values with their loved ones. And 4, completing advanced directives to put into writing what type of treatment they would or would not want should they be unable to speak for themselves. If we practice this, and these are required for the frontliners who are working in such pandemic situation, or these are the people who are aging or have too many comorbidities, one should try and make a proper will or an advanced directive for themselves. So decisions about end of life care are deeply personal and are based on patients' values and beliefs. So because it is impossible to foresee every type of circumstance or illness, it is essential to think in general about what is important to them. So conversations that focus on patients' wishes and beliefs will relieve the loved ones and healthcare providers of the need to guess what they would want. So there are so many instances which are happening and which we read now and then, that doctor was sued or hospital was sued or there were some mishaps happening in the hospital because of crowd. Most of the thing, the primary reason would be improper communication or understanding about the diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, and poor prognosis or death. So some way we need to document all these things, and wherein we healthcare workers were weaker when it went to the court of law. Next slide, please. So now we'll be talking about next slide. Next slide. Can you hear me? I can't see the next slide.
I know, but it's not moving.
Okay. Can you help in moving it?
1 second.
Question that we've got.
Sorry?
One question that we've got, whether the surrogate is same as the lawyer.
So surrogate, so now when you go to the definition of surrogate, it's a person who may or may not be a family member, but if the lawyer is the family person, like we have family physician, if he is the family lawyer, he can be surrogate.
So you mean that if the lawyer is a part of the family and designated by the patient?
Yes, if he is a part of the family and designated by the patient, he will not be the person who comes at the end and become a surrogate.
Okay. Okay.
So my brother's friend who is a lawyer and he was involved in taking care of me, and I nominate him as one of the surrogates, so it doesn't interfere in that legality. So he may be a lawyer or a doctor. Yeah.
Okay, so not a random lawyer, but somebody who is
yes, somebody
designated
who
by the
is
patient.
who is taking active care of the person and been designated by the patient.
Okay. So technology is giving us some challenges now. Mr. Ganeshan, has your technology sorted?
I'll proceed then.
Yeah, I think you can proceed from your this thing.
Okay. So now we talk about legal things. So what are the legal provisions available in India? So there are two things. One is from patient's perspective and the other is from physician perspective. Okay. So from patient's right, what are the rights of the patient? So patient has the right to refuse treatment.
Go on. What happened?
Okay. No, I thought someone is speaking. I can carry on?
Yes, carry on.
Yeah. So patient's right is the right to refuse treatment is a common law, and it has to be further strengthened by the law, and it has been strengthened by the Law Commission recommendations. There were two judgments on this. One was Justice Puttaswamy versus the Union of India. Right to privacy. I don't think so. People will hear because there is a lot of background noise. If they can mute it. Hello. If the people can mute themselves, then I think people can hear me.
Muted. Carry on.
Muted. Yeah. So two judgments. One was Justice Puttaswamy and versus Union of India. There was the right to privacy was declared as an independent fundamental right, which further protects patients' autonomy. The second was Common Cause versus Union of India. The Supreme Court clarified the legal validity of living will or advanced medical directive, and appropriate withdrawal or withholding life support was being taken care. The Indian patient or citizen has the right to execute an advanced medical directive that will be operational when he or she loses decision making capacity. So there should be appropriate withdrawal or withholding of life support will not attract criminal liability. Now this is a point which has to be understood for the people who are working in the healthcare hospital system in the ICU. So when we take consent from the patient's relative whether to take off the ventilator or not to take off the ventilator, or there are occasions wherein doctors or the medical people say that you have to go to the court of law and get the orders from the court when the patient is on ventilator. I mean, these are not the things which are correct totally. If you know this law, then yes, if there is a advanced medical directive, then we can withdraw or withhold the life support without interfering the code. This is legally mandated. And by international consensus, patients do not have the right to demand treatment that are not considered appropriate. All the doctors should listen this. Patients do not have the right to demand treatment that are not considered appropriate by their healthcare provider, as these are essentially medical decisions. So no one can force you to keep the patient on ventilator or put the ventilator if a physician feels that there is no need of ventilator support. And you have to document that refusal also. You need not be held guilty for this. What are the physician obligations? So I was talking about patients, now from physician's point of view. So according to bioethical norms in today's practice, the physician must integrate the four cardinal principles: autonomy, non-beneficence, beneficence, justice. So respect of autonomy is the central to all medical practice today. Interventions despite the refusal of the patient or his or her surrogates could be deemed as battery by the law. Like consent, refusal should also be duly documented, which most of the time we do in our practice, do not give importance. But writing the refusal one in a proper documentation is actually required. Physicians should be guided by standard treatment guidelines on end of life care. Now, there are so many doctors, physicians here who do not believe in this end of life care management thing. They just go on and on with their active management, which is legally not advisable, while weighing the benefit and harm of providing the life sustaining treatment. So what is the action plan? I mean, end of life care and decision making for doctors and administrators. So there are 4 points to be understood. Number one, respect a competent patient's decision. Now, what does that mean? When the patient who is competent refuses treatment, this should be honored, and respecting the decisions made by patient is required by law. So this decision should be respected even if the patient's family members express a different opinion regarding foregoing life support. So it's a very simple thing. If patient says no and family member says yes, and if doctor also feels no, then the answer is no. Second point is opt for shared decision making. Now, when does it come? If so, one has to. There is a suppose advanced medical directive. Patient is not competent, and if the situation comes in wherein doctor feels that we need to take this step, and that was not mentioned in the advanced medical directive, then the doctor can share that decision with the appointed caregiver or surrogate, and they both can override this AMD, which is very, very important. Most of the time we do not follow this, and that's the reason most of the time mishaps happen. So if the patient is incompetent, has a valid AMD, has to be honored as far as possible. If there are valid to override same in the best interest of the patient, a consensus should, through shared decision making, should be arrived at. So between the caregivers, surrogate, and doctor, and it has to be duly documented. The third point is base the decision on wishes of patient as well as the prognosis when there is no living will or medical directives available. So if there is no AMD available, the decision between caregivers and surrogates must be based on the values and wishes of the patient as known to the family, as well as the prognosis and best interest of the patient as judged by the treating doctors. So only under exceptional circumstances, such as when a person is in a persistent vegetative state, can the code recommended procedure be implemented. For example, in case of terminal cancer with imminent death, decision not to put the patient on ventilator needs to be taken within hours or few days. Decision not to be taken. So in this common scenario, the FLS decision must be based on refusal of consent for either initiation or continuation of life-sustaining treatment. In such cases, all decisions must be duly documented to ensure transparency. Fourth point is certify and document brain death.
So brain death should be certified and documented in the manner it has been laid down in the Transplantation of Human Organs and Tissues Act. The act was in 1994. So irrespective of whether there is a consent for organ donation or not, this is in conformity with the internationally accepted definition of death. So this position in law was further reiterated in the Aruna Shanbag judgment. If you remember, this was the case wherein in Mumbai, a nurse who was admitted for more than 3 decades and was in vegetative state, wherein the Supreme Court judgment passed on. So when brain death has been so certified, the patient can be disconnected from life support unilaterally after informing and counseling the family.
I'm clear.
Now, so we'll talk about something related to coronavirus, COVID situation. So if you see in last couple of months, we have globally reached more than 4 million cases. So that's the data up to 9th of May. Now suffering in patients and their families. So it's not only patient suffering, it's patient and family, both are suffering. The suffering can be categorized into 4: physical suffering, psychological suffering, social suffering, and spiritual suffering. So the physical suffering could be due to the direct effect of the illness and side effects of the treatment. It can be mitigated by rapid assessment of symptoms and treatment, training of the emergency healthcare providers in basics of palliative care. Psychological suffering could be due to the stigmatization of illness, social isolation, anxiety, depression, delirium. So it can also be due to the grief associated with loss and the survivor's guilt. It can be mitigated by having protocols for rapid assessment of anxiety, depression, delirium. Immediate steps include making benzodiazepines, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and haloperidol as the part of emergency and essential medications. Training the emergency and community healthcare providers in rapid assessment of psychological symptoms. Providing counseling support to people in social isolation via phone or video communication. Creating support groups for the survivors and bereaved family members. The social suffering could be due to disease stigmatization or social isolation, or being barred from the community due to the illness or negative perception of the illness, poverty. It can be mitigated by taking steps to meet the basic needs like food, shelter, clothing. Further steps may include community education about the illness and the fear of illness and stigma, creating voluntary social support groups, and involving the community and religious leaders for social support. The reasons for spiritual suffering may include loss of sense of the meaning of life, guilt, loss of faith, or anger towards God. It can be mitigated by providing spiritual support with all infection control strategies in place. So one possible approach is to develop community spiritual groups and involving religious leaders who can provide spiritual support telephonically or via video chat. So coming to the next slide. Next slide, please. So I'm very happy that the slides are working. Now, when we see coronavirus cases are increasing and it's been more than 4 million globally, we need to triage the needs. So this has been accepted by the WHO and WHO guidelines for integrating palliative and symptom relief into the response to humanitarian crisis like COVID. So the triaging system is basically, you can see the chart: 4, immediate, expectant, delayed, and minimal, and it's been coded accordingly. So immediate is red code, expectant blue, delayed is yellow, and minimal is green, and accordingly we can take the action. Coming to the next slide. This is purely medical, mainly for doctors and nurses who are actively managing the coronavirus patient. So I have taken 4 important symptoms to discuss today. Number 1, management of breathlessness in patients with serious COVID-19 infections. So mild so there are scoring of 1 to 10. If your score is between 1 to 4, the medical management, high flow oxygen, positioning, cold front end on the face. So these are the non-pharmacological measures which you have to do. When the symptoms are moderate, score between 5 to 6, then you follow the milder strategies plus improve the medical management. So here we introduce morphine and escalate the dose as and when required. So use of morphine, use of lorazepam, and if there is any opioid-induced vomiting or nausea, you can use metoclopramide and bisacodyl for constipation. If the management goes to severe part, so if your scoring is more than 6, then yes, you can use injectable morphine. The dosage we have written there, the midazolam IV. And if you have a syringe pump, you can go for a continuous infusion. Next slide, please. One of the important symptoms in COVID, so patient in delirium or agitation. So we have categorized into 3 part again. So mild delirium, the non-pharmacological things like it should be a quiet room with less visual or auditory excitation. Preferably, the bed should be by the side of window. And if you see the newer hospitals coming up, these are the things which they have taken care of. All the SCT cancer center, I guess, have windows open for the patients. Reorientation techniques, consistency of the nursing staff, so not to have new faces every now and then. It's better to have the similar faces, similar people who have developed the rapport with the patient. Avoiding physical restraints and pharmacological measures, you can include haloperidol and avoid benzodiazepines. So delirium with agitation, you should follow the same non-pharmacological strategies plus increase or improve the management by having haloperidol infusion. If agitation and restlessness without delirium, then non-pharmacological measures plus introducing lorazepam here. And if the symptoms are going on a severe side, midazolam drip can be given. Next slide. So the third most important symptom is respiratory secretion management. So non-pharmacological includes optimization of hydration, judicious use of parenteral hydration, avoiding oropharyngeal suctioning, preventing aspiration, and positioning. Pharmacological, we use primarily glycopyrrolate and atropine. Next slide, please. The fourth most important symptom is pain. I mean, you have gone to the, this is the right slide. So pain management. Now here again, we have scored from 1 to 10. If the pain management score is between 1 to 3, you can use oral paracetamol. And if patient is not in a position to use oral, you can use IV paracetamol. And then elicit what type of pain is patient suffering from, whether nociceptive or neuropathic. And if it is neuropathic pain, then you can start with gabapentin, and the dosage has to be escalated as and when required. But avoid NSAIDs. That's the important thing in COVID. You need not use more of NSAIDs. The moderate pain score between 4 to 6, then use the mild version plus introduction of opioids, preferably morphine on a lower dose. If patient is not in a position to take morphine orally, then can give injectable morphine or consider fentanyl if patient has renal failure. If pain score is more than 6, then you can go for infusion of morphine as well as consider fentanyl infusion if renal failure. Next slide, please. So when the management for intractable or unmanageable symptoms, the first line is giving dose of midazolam infusion. If a patient is not settling with that, try to increase the dosage of midazolam by 30% of the initial dose. If still there is no response to incremental doses and patient is having severe distress, whatsoever the reason may be because of breathlessness or because of delirium or because of pain, which is not being manageable, then go to second line of management, that's introducing phenobarbital. And if phenobarbital on higher dose also patient is not managing, which is very rare. So on very rare occasions, severe distressing symptoms can be controlled, or we can consider giving propofol, which I have not given in my practice of 10.5 years, but then you can consider this also. So here I would like to end the session. Next slide, please. So I hope everyone hope the same what I am writing on the last slide. Everyone hopes for a good death, or rather a good life to the very end. So yes, one should plan for good life as well as plan for dying process, so that there is no confusion in the family members and within yourself. The decision can change from time to time. It's like your will which you make for your properties, for your money. It's the same thing, you make a will for your life. And I hope this session was informative. Given a time frame, I could only cover this much, but there is a lot of things which we can talk in near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sunil. And there are, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions coming for you. Some of these questions are already in the chat box and you can start typing out the answers. Meanwhile, I would request Dr. Geeta to come on board and start her presentation. Dr. Geeta.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Vijay, could you please start the slides? Okay. While Vijay starts sharing the screen for my slides, I think since the predominant group here has been psychiatrists, and I see that most of them are psychiatrists. So and also Dr. Sunil has actually kind of covered some part of psychopharmacology. What we had discussed was in terms of what is the role of psychiatrists in end-of-life care, and I probably will focus more on grief, because I think as psychiatrists, probably in future, we are more likely to see the consequences of what happens in the next couple of months, or probably what's been happening. We are going to see different manifestations of grief in the survivors, and probably different ways of presenting. So, Vijay, can you make it into a slideshow? So I think Dr. Sunil has actually kind of discussed in detail about what is end-of-life care. So I'm not going into any of the definitions, or he's kind of lucidly discussed. So I think, but you know, when he was describing about the treatments and how to manage, I thought, where does the psychiatrist fit in this? So I think the whole concept of palliative care psychiatry has kind of started with palliative care more in cancer rather than in other disorders. Of course, now palliative care is not just limited to cancer, but it is also other conditions like chronic heart failure or COPD and other areas where palliative care strategies. In fact, I think there's a very interesting paper on palliative care in chronic mental disorders. So I think it's probably now getting a stronger footing. So what is it that a psychiatrist can, what is its role? So I think I came across this interesting thing called concept of total pain. What we generally talk about, I think pain, the moment we talk about cancer, pain is something that automatically comes into our mind. So total pain basically means it's not just focusing just on physical pain, but it's focusing on psychological, psychological distress, emotional distress, spiritual distress, social problems. All these becomes a very much part of the pain, the total pain. So that is actually the goal of, elevating the total pain and addressing total pain becomes an important aspect. And since psychological aspects, spiritual distress, these are all very much part of it, I think the role of psychiatrist is very essential. Now, what are the things the psychiatrist could do? I think probably in COVID times, the challenges are very different because the progression is sometimes very fast. So some of the things generally what the palliative care psychiatrists are expected screening for psychological distress and syndromes like depression and anxiety, delirium. The other aspects are probably, I mean, I think they're straightforward ones, is talking about death and dying. I'm not sure how we are far more equipped in talking about death and dying, but probably we read, I mean, we deal with cases of grief and other things. So I think that's a discussion. That discussion with patients is something that we have a role. Then handling grief. I think handling grief probably to the family members and their supportive group, as well as grief related in the health professionals. I think these are some of the roles that a psychiatrist has in end of life care. Of course, I'm sure there might be other situations the psychiatrists who are there in the group can actually mention. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So, like I mentioned, I think psychological aspect is something that is, I'll see the slides on another computer. Is what is it that is different in COVID times, end of life care? I mean, I think some of the things that Dr. Sunil already mentioned is about, one is barriers in accessing care. I think that's one challenge, especially for patients who have had other sorts of problems and COVID makes it difficult. Interruptions in treatment, less family visits can happen if they are admitted to a hospice or another hospital. And if they are at home, accessing care is also a big challenge. And death and dying in COVID times is probably, even if somebody doesn't die because of COVID, because they die of some other reason, I think there's so much of anxiety associated with dying during this COVID times. Vijay, are you able to move the slides?
Dr. Vijay, Geeta needs some help for change of slides.
Yeah, I am doing it. I'm doing it. Can you see?
No, it's not moving. It's all right. You see whether you can go to slide number 5.
5. Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Vijay, and also it has to go on full screen.
So I think most of the issues that we discuss in end of life care, especially the role of psychiatrist, is in terms of communication. I think communication is the key. The second aspect that I would want to highlight is handling grief, because I think grief is something that probably we need to prepare ourselves. Sometimes psychiatrists are called in to handle the acute grief reactions. And so I was just reading a little bit about, what is this grief anyway different in COVID times? What are the challenges that people, see in handling grief? Because grief is grief, whether it happens, but it's a very interesting thing that I wanted to share. I think COVID times has probably made expression of grief difficult. Probably it also has access to care in grief, another challenge. Third thing is also about what the kind of rituals, funerals and other things have also become difficult. So if you look at normal grief, I mean, I think it's in a very interesting article in 2009 World Psychiatry. The authors actually say there's nothing like normal, because the moment we say normal, the definition is a problem. So they say it's uncomplicated grief. So in uncomplicated grief is generally has emotional, cognitive, physical, and behavioral symptoms, which we are all aware of. So basically the progression is from the acute grief, it moves on to integrated grief, where the person generally resolves or gets back to their life and functioning improves, and the relationship they share with the disease also kind of, resolves or probably has a different meaning. So that's for us a normal grief. Now what happens and how is this facilitated? How does one grieve if it's a normal phenomena? So what are the things that a person does? Yeah? What are the things that the person does to overcome this process. So I think since it's a universal phenomena, normal phenomena, there's no intervention required by a psychiatrist. Now, what is likely to happen in COVID times? I think some challenges that I can discuss includes, I think the disease progresses fast. They feel isolated, even for the person who's in the ICU, isolated from their family because of transmission risks. So one, dying alone, that is one thing. Not having, I mean, if you look at descriptions of good death, is many of them feel that it should be sudden, but they should have their family members around them when they're dying. So these are some of the things that have been, but in COVID times, isolation, and they could also see other people who are dying in front of them. They're in a family, there could be multiple losses. There is limited contact with family members, friends, and they're not prepared. The time for preparation for death. I mean, I think one of the predictors for complicated grief is not preparing oneself for death, which is possibly which is difficult in these times. And as we have all seen that, in the last couple of weeks, there's so much of discussion about the funerals and the difficulties in performing rituals and funerals, because there's good data to say that these things can actually facilitate a resolution of grief well. And then there is stigma. I think stigma is so rampant, and especially during this time, I mean, we know that people are not allowed to follow the burial rituals, and so they're not only, the families not only have to deal with the loss of the person, but they also have to deal with a lot of stigma and isolation. So they're less likely to get social support. And also because I think I agree with Dr. Sunil that, probably we've really not caught on this advance directive. I'm not sure how many of us have made advance directives or wills, because we still think somehow in our mind it may not happen to us, but we are not very proactive in forming advance directives. But I think it is important. But often I think these are not present. So we are always in a dilemma of how to go about it. Now, well, like I said, there are many barriers in normal resolution of grief during this period of time. I think the slides are not moving forward. Okay.
It is moving. It's complicated
No,
grief now. Can you see?
don't.
It says
No.
your screen sharing, and it says,
Can others?
Can Dr. Vani see? Can you see complicated grief slide on the screen?
No,
No.
we are able to see the slides, but
Which slide? Which slide? Which slide? Sir? Which
First slide, end of life care in COVID times. We are only
That's
able
the first slide.
First slide.
First slide.
So you will have to move the slide. Now it moved. Now it moved. Now it moved.
Okay, can you make it into slide? Okay, fine. I mean, I think I'm almost.
Can you see? Can you see complicated? It's complicated grief now.
Yeah. Now I think. So I thought I will address a little bit on complicated grief, because I've kind of highlighted why normal grief resolution can be a challenge during COVID times, and now what is actually, are we likely to see a surge in complicated grief, which I don't know. I don't have the answer right now. No, what is complicated grief? It's interesting that while we are going through all this code, ICD-11 is actually going to propose this as a diagnostic category. That means prolonged grief disorder. Now, why is it that it has got an independent diagnostic? Because I think complicated grief itself has a significant impact on physical as well as mental health of an individual. So that's the reason why I'm going to talk a little bit about complicated grief. Now, what is complicated grief? Basically, like I was mentioning, from acute to the grief tends to become integrated and then resolves. But in complicated grief, this resolution doesn't happen and they're stuck at acute. When I'm not really discussing about signs and symptoms of grief, I'm just kind of taking you through what is likely to happen. It is intense and prolonged. So next slide. Vijay, next slide.
Sorry, it's stuck.
Okay, so if you, what are the factors that are likely to predict complicated grief?
Can you see
Basically,
now?
yes,
see?
yes. So
Oh,
what is it that we can, no, I can't see, sorry. Anyway, I'm seeing in my other screen. So what are the factors that are likely to cause? I mean, if you, it would have been good if you could see, but basically, if somebody has had previous loss, if, can you make it slideshow? I think it's important for us to remember when we evaluate the family members, if they have any of these issues, they are more likely to develop. Like, for example, this is based on a systematic review on looking at when does normal grief become complicated grief. I think prior to death, these are the things, like, for example, previous loss, exposure to trauma, previous psychiatric history, attachment style, relationship with the disease. With death, suppose violent deaths, quality of caregiving and dying experience. Now, unfortunately, this becomes the second point is a bit of a concern, because when the person is unwell, the caregiving might not happen. So this could result in guilt in the individual. So some of the things that I have just mentioned, of course, slides can be shared. And the social support. Now, with this, so much of fear and stigma, social support is going to be. So these are some of the reasons why I thought I should bring up complicated grief. Right, next slide. Vani, I have one or two slides, I'll finish. So I think in this aspect, I thought I should talk about a little bit about bereavement guilt, which we will have to deal with. One, this is something that probably we have to address. It may not present immediately, but it might present at various points of time. The fact that responsibility guilt, that's like, for example, if somebody has not taken the adequate precautions or taken them to a different hospital, provided early intervention, if that's not been, the person might have responsibility guilt, or might have said something which has hurt the deceased. Survivor guilt. Like, for example, I know that there are families where the younger one was not affected, but they were positive, because of which transmitted to an elderly person who passed away. So these are the situations which could induce survivor guilt and indebtedness guilt. So I'm just kind of running through, so we have more time for discussion. We can talk about how to handle complicated grief. And I think for psychiatrists, it becomes important to see what is normal uncomplicated grief, what is complicated grief and major depression, because our interventions differ according to our diagnosis. Suppose it's an uncomplicated grief, I think we really don't need to do any intervention. We just have to wait and watch. If they have adequate supports and the family is there, we just need to, let pass. But I think the fear for all of us would be whether are we missing major depression or complicated grief. Now, what is it that indicates major depression? I think one of few pointers towards why it could be, one is going on for a long period of time, which can happen in complicated grief, very severe. Nature of symptoms. I think cognitive symptoms more likely to indicate major depression, whereas in uncomplicated grief and complicated, it's the it's actually the cognitions are related to the death or the individual who is deceased. And suicidality can happen in both complicated grief, but the reasons that they give might be very different. Guilt feelings. Again, guilt feelings are very different in complicated grief and major depression. In major depression, guilt feelings are more related to, they're more pervasive and generalized, whereas guilt feelings which happen in complicated grief is something that I mentioned in the previous slide. Next slide, please. I think I'll just, communication is the key here. breaking bad news, especially when things change very quickly, is, you know, where the person was fine within 24 hours, 48 hours, if things deteriorate, how do we communicate? Of course, the psychiatrist may not be the first person who will actually break the bad news, but I think the psychiatrist can be an important part of the team who will actually talk to the families, because we know that there might be multiple members of the families. How we respond, I think how we recognize emotions, this is more, psychiatrists can also train the frontline workers using some two pictures I have, I'll show you, which we wrote for frontline workers, how to handle acute grief. So next, I'll leave this communication bit. Vijay, next slide. So this is something that I, along with my colleagues, wrote for the book that we wrote on psychiatric issues in COVID times, handling grief. Basically, this has few steps, but this is more for acute grief and what are the things that any frontline worker can do, how to talk to them, what are the things that, how to respond to a particular kind of emotions. So I think it is there on NIMHANS website, anybody can see. So this is something that we thought we can share it with any frontline workers who actually do this on a day-to-day basis. So I think I just wanted to just focus only on grief because we thought that's an important thing. Breaking bad news and other things, each one of them have their own components. So I just have only slides on grief, and I have put this. So in conclusions, I just want to say that, you know, grief is something all psychiatrists, as psychiatrists, we have to deal with it. Maybe we may not handle acute grief, but we, at some point, we will be discussing because of the, when it becomes complicated. I think we also need to kind of probably become trainers in terms of, you know, in terms of talking about death and dying, breaking bad news, handling acute grief. I think there are two things. Last, I think being compassionate, especially for psychiatrists, I think we see more, I wouldn't say COVID deaths, we probably would see patient suicide and other things. So that's where I think we being compassionate towards not only the family members and patients, but also towards us. I think that's very, very important. And in all this end of life care, I think one important aspect is not only caring for patients and family members, but also caring for the carers. I think that's caring for the carers. I mean, frontline health workers. I think as psychiatrists, we have responsibility, or our involvement is essential even towards them. Thank you. I think we are running out of time.
Thanks a lot, Geeta. One of the questions that's come up repeatedly in the chat box is that some of the relatives are not coming forward even to claim the dead bodies because of their, let's say it's a complicated grief reaction. So what would be the role of the psychiatrist in such a?
I mean, I think first is there's one, illness anxiety. I think for them, fear of falling sick is the biggest fear. And so what, and they're also not very sure about how to actually take care of the whole funeral and other things. I think that's where probably in that advanced care planning, what Dr. Sunil was discussing. So there's some discussion also in terms of sometimes patients can come up with that, and talking to family members about how it has to be handled even before something like that happens is very important, but it may not be possible in all cases. But I think fear of getting the illness is the biggest thing, and then we should, and many of them don't want to kind of express that, you know, because they would be seen as the bad people.
Correct.
Who are, you know,
rejecting their duties, but there is a genuine fear there, and I think education also needs to be done, and some kind of practical help in terms of this thing.
Yeah.
Okay. I think another message, I think this is a question for both of you. What would be, how should the physicians motivate themselves in this difficult times? Dr. Sunil, would you like to answer first?
See, there is nothing called as motivation. All the physicians or healthcare workers who are actually working in this situation, they are working because they know what the disease they are facing, how to take care, the preventive measures, what are the treatment options available. And the doctors who are, or the healthcare workers who are not working, I think there are two things. Either they are too fear or they have their own reasons for not coming out and staying with their family, or they have certain other motives. We don't know what their family dimensions or their personal dimensions are. But any doctors or healthcare worker who know how to take care of one own self and who have prepared, like we have prepared, we are still going out and seeing patients. So there's nothing called as motivation. It's all about knowledge.
Geeta, what would you like to say?
I think there's nothing like motivation, but I think self-care is something that's very, very important. If we can choose to see what side of we are in. If you want to focus on the dismal picture, or you want to focus on the positive or the negative, I think that's what I would look at it.
Yeah. It's also depending upon the support system. I mean, how you supported well, both physically, psychologically, socially, financially, and with government. So if I think healthcare workers are being more supported from the government sector, that will motivate some of the people who are not actively participating in the patient care. So if government is not taking that extra care or providing that extra support to the healthcare workers, maybe a doctor, nurse, attendants, or any such person who are actively involved in nursing home or hospital care, I think that is the first step we need to bring in. Otherwise, all the people who are motivated are becoming healthcare workers. Nobody is forced to become a doctor or a nurse, and if they are forced, they are not practicing. So they have already chosen the other branch. They are not waiting for COVID situation, I guess.
That's right. So I think this is a very important topic, but it's still evolving, because I think the grief reaction is also a very culture-based kind of thing. And what will come ahead of us, even the end of life treatments chosen by patients or their families are also based in culture. So what is going to happen is really something that each of us is going to learn and share as we go. So I would say that through this webinar, we have just opened the topic, and we have just unsettled a few thoughts, and all of us have to really cross-pollinate our experiences and opinions to make it further fine-tuned. And with this, I bring the webinar to a close. And I warmly thank Dr. Sunil and Dr. Geeta for joining us and sharing with us their knowledge and experience. Thank you.
Thank you, organizers, and all the viewers, listeners, the colleagues, the friends. I mean, I'm very happy to be here on this platform to discuss very important topic, and it should go on a wavelength. I mean, let's connect again.
Yeah, thank you, Vani. Thank you, Vani, for a wonderful show. Unfortunately, technology wasn't with us today. I made several attempts, but unfortunately, it got stuck. And
don't worry, technology will never come. Science is always there, and we will always speak. We don't want any.
I owe an apology to the audience.
Don't be.
That's fine.
And thank you to the participants, and because of them we are able to run this show. Thanks Dr. Sunil, Dr. Geeta, and Dr. Vani, Dr. Manjula Madam, and also Mr. Ganeshan from Microlabs, my colleagues Mahesh and Dr. Jagdish as well. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Bye. Good night.